On a quiet summer night, Friday, August 17th, 2007, in the small town of Carrier Mills, Illinois, a man named Van was enjoying a relaxing evening after a long week. He had just finished soaking in the bath and was heading to his living room to turn off the stereo when his sense of calm was shattered by a loud bang. Suddenly, a bullet came flying through his kitchen wall, bouncing around the room and narrowly missing him. Van immediately called 911 in a panic and told dispatchers that the bullet came from the neighboring apartment in his ranch-style duplex. Luckily, a local officer was handling a traffic stop nearby, and 4 minutes later, at 10:58 p.m., he was in Van's living room. The first stop for the officer would have been the other apartment to check on the person who made the complaint, ensure it was legitimate, and make sure he was okay. When the officer arrived, Van recounted his evening, which he said was uneventful until the bullet came flying through his wall. He mentioned that he didn't remember anything out of the ordinary happening at his neighbor's apartment and told the officer that 3 young women lived there. All he had heard earlier in the evening was maybe some walking around, then heavier stomping footsteps, and a few loud bumps. Once, he said he heard a loud female voice, but there was no arguing or yelling, nothing alarming. He also said he didn't hear anything after the shot was fired, no door slamming or footsteps leaving, although his stereo was still on. The officer then headed back outside, just as deputies from the Saline County Sheriff's Office arrived. Obviously, their next step was to go to the apartment to see if everyone inside was okay. They noticed that the lights were on inside, but when they knocked on the door, no one answered. One of the deputies squinted through the front window blinds to see if there was any movement and saw the lower part of someone's legs motionless on the floor. With no more waiting around, the officers made their way inside through the unlocked door. Right away, they saw a teenage girl lying on her back on the living room floor, with her arms and legs spread out in almost a starfish position in front of an entertainment center. There was a big pool of blood soaking the carpet to the right of her head and a smaller puddle on her left side. It was obvious what had happened to her, a gunshot wound in her temple. Police could tell that she was shot at point-blank range in the right side of her head. The story of Jade Winston is a jaw-dropping tale of how just a few days in August 2007 turned a family completely upside down, leaving one Illinois mother searching and waiting for answers for 16 years. Tired of waiting, a team dug deep into this case, which many have probably never heard of, in hope of finding the truth. Under the bend of the teenage girl's left knee, there was a 9mm handgun. Strangely, the clip of the gun was resting in her left hand. Just 3 minutes after walking in the door, based on their initial observations, the police radioed dispatchers and the Saline County Chief Deputy Major Todd Fort that the victim's gunshot wound was apparently self-inflicted. However, even if it looked self-inflicted, it seemed too early to make that call. Some guns can fire without clips, and it's worth noting that the officers didn't see any signs of a struggle or forced entry. Still, it was too early to make a definitive call. As quickly as they said that out loud, things took a turn. When Chief Deputy Major Todd Fort arrived and checked out the scene, he got a gut feeling that something was off. He thought that it looked staged. It's kind of bizarre that a chief deputy major would attend crime scenes, but this was a really small department with few investigators. So for this area, it wasn't that unusual. Fortunately, his presence was a good thing, because he noticed something that no one else seemed to pay attention to before. The big pool of blood on the floor. The big pool of blood should have been under and right next to the girl's head, but it was actually a few inches away. Even though she was flat on her back, the blood from the entry wound on her temple had flowed upward to her face, around her nose, and across her lips. If she had shot herself and fallen, the blood should have been flowing back towards her hair. This suggested that she might have gone face first to the floor, creating one pool of blood, and then was possibly flipped over, which could explain the 2 pools of blood and the fact that one of them was further away from her head. However, the question remained: who would have moved her? The police certainly hadn't. Todd told the reporter, Nina, that he wasn't ready to jump to any conclusions at that point, although he did quickly tell dispatch that it looked like they were investigating a homicide. To be fair, that's how all investigations should start, to ensure that nothing is missed. You only get one chance to see a crime scene for the first time. You can't go back and redo it. The police determined that 3 young women lived in the apartment: 17-year-old Jory Crawford, her friend, 21-year-old Jana Mitchell, and Jana's sister, 18-year-old Jade Winston. The police assumed that one of the 3 women who lived in the apartment, Jana, Jade, or Jory, must be the victim. As the investigation was unfolding, some young women pulled up to the duplex. One of them, later identified as Jana, hopped out of the car and ran up to the door, clearly distressed to find police swarming around. The other girl, who was circling nearby or had parked the car, was identified as Jory. With Jana and Jory accounted for, the police quickly began speculating that Jade was the victim inside the apartment. What happened next is a bit confusing, as everyone interviewed by the reporter Nina had a slightly different recollection of how things went down. When the girls first arrived, Jana had a rush of panic, not because she thought something had happened to her sister, but because her boyfriend had been arrested a few months ago and was in jail at the time with his trial about to start. She thought that maybe the police presence had something to do with that, so she called her mom, Mary, to come over. Around the same time, Jory received a shocking phone call from a friend. The caller said that Jory's ex-boyfriend, whom we'll call Peter, was telling people that Jade was dead and that Jory was the one who killed her. This was how they were finding out about Jade's death, as nobody except the police knew she was dead at that point. It was unclear how Jory's ex knew about the death, and how he was already making accusations about who killed her. It didn't make sense, and while word can spread fast in small towns, it doesn't spread that fast. This raised questions about whether Peter had some connection with the police department, but he was known for causing trouble, especially for Jory, and wasn't exactly the law-abiding type. However, accusing her of murder and saying that her roommate was dead was extreme and above and beyond his usual behavior. Jory told Jana about the call, and soon after, investigators confirmed the devastating news that Jade had indeed died from a gunshot wound. Right about that time, Jana and Jade's mom, Mary, arrived. She didn't know what was going on and wasn't even worried about Jade, assuming she was at work or with her boyfriend. Jana then had to deliver the worst news a parent can hear. The commotion around the apartment drew a crowd, including Peter, who lived just a few blocks away. When Jana and Jade's brother, Jerome Mitchell, arrived, Peter was the first to greet him, as the 2 men were good friends. Jana watched as the 2 men hugged. After Jana watched her brother Jerome hug Peter, the next thing she knew, Jerome was running towards her, demanding to know where Jory was. It seemed that Peter had already told Jerome the same story about Jory killing Jade. Jana quickly told her brother that the accusation against Jory wasn't true and that Jory didn't do anything. However, in the chaos, Jana didn't have the chance to fully consider the implications of Peter's rumor. Peter was practically forgotten amidst the commotion. Jerome tried to get into the apartment and ended up tussling with the police. People were yelling and arguing, and everyone was devastated. It's important to note that while the sheriff's office provided a bunch of records through the FOIA, it's clear that a lot of information is still missing. Combined with people remembering things differently, it's impossible to ever know the full story. Detectives hit the ground running early that Saturday morning. A crime scene investigator examined the apartment where Jade was found and noted blood on Jade's clothes and small stains on the coffee table and nearby wall. He found a spent shell casing on the floor by the entertainment center and spotted a bullet hole in the wall, perfectly aligned with the one in the neighbor's kitchen, about 20 inches off the ground. The gun itself was collected and found to have had an empty chamber and 3 live rounds in the detached magazine. The origin of the gun is not so clear-cut. Jana and Jory initially told the police that they found the gun last month after a party they threw, and Jana had wrapped it in a white hoodie and stashed it in the entertainment center. However, They later told the reporter that this wasn't true. The gun had actually belonged to Jana's boyfriend, who was also Jory's brother. He had been in legal trouble and was in prison, so he wasn't supposed to have a gun. They lied to cover for him and avoid getting him into more trouble. While the apartment was being examined, other officers were fielding incoming leads about suspicious dark-colored cars in the area around the time of the shooting. They were also interviewing everyone at the scene, especially those in Jade's inner circle. They discovered that Friday had been a pretty typical day for Jade. She went to school, then to volleyball practice, and had to catch a ride from a friend to take her to work at RB because Jana was using the car that the sisters shared. This apparently irritated Jade to some degree. Jade's time card showed that she clocked in at 5:37 p.m., and her co-workers told the police that she was uncharacteristically gloomy that day, a far cry from her usual bubbly, goofy self. She had even asked for a smoke break, even though she didn't smoke. Jade told her co-workers that the reason for her gloominess was her cheating boyfriend, whom we'll call Nick. Apparently, a week before, she had gotten into it with one of her so-called friends, because rumor had it that Nick had gotten this friend pregnant. The friend had been harassing Jade with nasty, threatening phone calls. To add to Jade's troubles, a different girl had come into RB's on that very Friday and started some drama with Jade over Nick. It seemed that Nick was causing more trouble than he was worth. In situations like these, it's natural to want to tell these young women that they are worth so much more than anyone who puts them in such situations and makes them feel this way. Someone cheating is not a reflection of the person being cheated on, not being enough, or not giving them what they need. It's a reflection of the cheater being a terrible person. It's important to find someone who values you. Despite the drama, it seemed that Jade had a good co-worker friend who was trying to lift her spirits. They suggested making plans to go out after their shift to try and cheer her up. Jade clocked out at 9:44 p.m. and walked to the nearby Walmart, where her sister Jana worked, to get the car keys. Jana told investigators that when Jade came by, she was agitated, but that wasn't really surprising. Jana figured Jade was still just annoyed about having to share the car and not getting it earlier. Jana was aware of all the drama Jade was dealing with, which likely contributed to her understanding of Jade's mood. Jade grabbed the keys and told Jana she was going to go home, shower, then drop the car back at Walmart for Jana to use, and then she was going to go out with her co-worker. However, police learned that she didn't head straight home. Instead, she drove about 12 minutes northeast to where Nick was living to confront him. She searched for him at his friend's place, and when she couldn't find him, she called him at around 10:06 p.m. Nick told detectives that they spoke, and Jade accused him of cheating and was really upset, but they didn't actually meet up. Afterwards, Jade went home, where her uncle briefly stopped by at around 10:40 p.m. to exchange some DVDs with her. At some point, she must have changed her mind about going out because she ignored a text from her coworker and decided to settle in to watch one of the High School Musical movies and work on a dance routine for a kids' team that she helped out with. Jory was home with Jade, but not for long, as she had plans to go out with Jana. Since Jade wasn't going to be meeting her friend after all, they decided that Jory would take the car and pick up Jana from work so that Jade didn't have to leave at all. According to Jory, she left at around 10:45 p.m., and when she left, Jade was on the couch watching her movie. 9 minutes after Jory left, the neighbor had a bullet fly through his wall. If Jade was murdered, the perpetrator would have had to come inside, find the gun in the entertainment center, and fire a clean contact shot at Jade's temple in less than 10 minutes. To make the murder scenario believable, one would almost have to presume that the killer would know where the gun was located, as finding it within the 10-minute window seems to be the biggest question mark. However, there's still a chance that Jade died by suicide. One question that hasn't been answered is whether Jade actually knew the gun was in the house and its location. While she exchanged DVDs with her uncle and would have been in the entertainment center, possibly stumbling across the gun, Everyone told the police that Jade was terrified of guns. Additionally, the High School Musical DVD was still playing when the police arrived, and Jade was dressed in a sweatsuit, seemingly ready to dance. It seems odd that she would find a gun and decide to take her own life instead of dancing, especially considering the timing. Another option to consider is an accident. If Jade didn't like guns and wasn't familiar with them, she might have stumbled across the gun randomly and accidentally fired it while holding it, due to her discomfort and unfamiliarity with the weapon. However, the police feel they can rule this out because of the point-blank range of the gunshot. The gun was held up to Jade's temple, which doesn't align with the scenario of her finding the gun, not knowing what to do with it, and it going off accidentally. In that case, there wouldn't be the contact wound that she had. As the medical examiner and the detectives discussed the case during Jade's autopsy later that Saturday, they were just as stumped as everyone else. Determining Jade's cause of death was easy: a gunshot wound. However, the manner of death was not so clear-cut. The blood flowing up Jade's face could only be explained by her being in a face-down position after the shooting, according to the medical examiner. However, he didn't believe that she could have moved on her own after the shot was fired. He also didn't think that her position matched up with the blood splatter or the bullet trajectory. For Jade's body to be positioned to match up with the bullet hole in the wall, the bullet would have needed to travel at a 90-degree angle after exiting her body, which isn't how physics works. The only way it makes sense is if her body was moved. The medical examiner had no clue what actually happened and didn't make any ruling on Jade's manner of death. Everyone agreed that there were some strange things going on, but more work needed to be done to figure out what it all meant. Usually, as investigators learn more, the picture becomes clearer. However, every new detail in this case seemed to muddy the waters even further. Meanwhile, the community was just as confused as everyone else, and gossip was filling the information void. The rumor mill was churning, with some people saying that Jade died by suicide, some claiming Jory killed her, and others speculating that the bullet was meant for Jory or even Jana, and that Jade, who was only home because of a last-minute change of plans, was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. It should have been Jory home alone at that time, based on the original plan. Jade was supposed to take the car back to Jana, who would then come back, get Jory, and go out together. However, the small window of time in which the incident occurred suggests that the killer would have had to have been outside watching the house. If that had actually happened, they would have likely seen Jory leave, making the mistaken identity theory less plausible. There were also rumors that maybe Nick or the girl he was cheating with killed Jade because Jade was pregnant, which turned out to be false. Other rumors suggested that another girl who had problems with Jade might have done it, but there was nothing concrete to support this either. Many of the rumors that made it to the police were fifth-hand accounts, making it difficult to put much stock in those stories. However, some common themes started to emerge, and one name kept popping up over and over again: Peter, Jory's ex. Investigators learned that Peter, who was 22, was not a great guy and had a bad reputation. When he was 16, he was charged with attempted murder and aggravated battery. Since he was a juvenile, the court records were not accessible, so the exact details of what happened were unknown. However, it was known that he pled guilty to battery and got 2 years probation. At the time of Jade's death, there wasn't much on Peter's adult record, but he was known to be violent towards his girlfriends. Jory told the reporter that she had caught him smoking crack before, which led to a huge fight, and that he had locked her in his room a couple of times. Jory had lived with Peter at his parents' place when they were together, and after they split, she moved in with Jana. Peter moved in with his uncle, just down the street from them, and Jory and Jana would see him standing in front of his uncle's house, seemingly monitoring their comings and goings. When he wasn't physically watching them, he'd be making threatening phone calls to Jory. However, Jory said she didn't hear from Peter on the day Jade was killed, and she didn't see him or any other suspicious happenings. Even so, she started to wonder if the bullet was really meant for her, and if Peter had gone there to harass her, ended up being more violent and fought with Jade instead. It's unclear if Peter would have known where the gun was. Jana and Jory said that he had never come into the apartment, at least not that they knew of. It's also not super clear who knew that the gun was there. To show how confusing the situation is, Jana initially didn't even think Jory knew about the gun being there, but it turned out that Jory did, which means that maybe Jade did too. If Jade did know that the gun was there, her family has a theory that maybe she went for the gun to protect herself if Peter or someone else showed up, and then the other person managed to grab it and shoot her. However, the point-blank shot to the temple raises questions about this scenario. The problem with this case is that every time a plausible theory emerges, it hits a brick wall. However, Jade's family keeps coming back to the fact that Peter seemed to know Jade was dead before they even knew what had happened in the apartment, and they question how he knew that. This fact is especially upsetting to Jade and Jana's brother Jerome, who is friends with Peter and has known him for a long time. As Jade's loved ones gathered at her mom Mary's house on Saturday, Jerome was stewing. The more he agonized over the situation and the more he drank, the more he wanted to confront Peter immediately. However, Jerome's fiancée, who was super close with Jade, was determined not to let that happen. Although she wanted answers just like everyone else, she was also 5 months pregnant with her and Jerome's second child, so she didn't want him driving around in his current condition. Jerome's fiancée and his friends moved his car somewhere else and hid his car keys to prevent him from confronting Peter in his current state. However, what she didn't realize was that he had a spare set of keys. Late that night, or possibly early Sunday morning, Jerome told his fiancée that he was going to the bathroom. Instead, he snuck out of his mom's house, found his car keys, and left. When his fiancée, Panics, realized he was gone, people kept reassuring her that he probably just needed some time to process everything and that he would be back soon. Mary, trapped in a haze of grief over Jade, assumed Jerome was hanging out in her yard with his friends, so she fell asleep. Eventually, Jerome's fiancée laid down on the couch for a nap too. At around 2:30 Sunday morning, a knock at the door woke everyone up. It was the police, but they weren't there about Jade's case. They told Mary that Jerome had been in a bad accident and that he didn't survive. The death of a child is grief like no other, but losing 2 children within 27 hours was almost unfathomable for Mary. When Mary frantically called family to share the news, they genuinely thought she had lost it, insisting that it was Jade who had died, not Jerome. But Mary wasn't mistaken. Over the next few days, everyone started to wonder if there was more to this than just a tragic drunk driving accident, given the bizarre circumstances of the crash. The family and investigators put together a timeline around the crash. Around 1 or 1:30 Sunday morning, a totally wrecked Jerome showed up at Peter's uncle's house where Peter was staying. The uncle told police that Jerome tried to fight Peter, and they had some kind of confrontation. Jerome might have taken a swing at Peter, but it's not clear how bad they got into it. At the end of whatever happened, the uncle said that he offered to drive Jerome home, but Jerome just gave him a hug and told him that he was going to shoot up a place or die or something, which doesn't make a lot of sense. After leaving Peter's uncle's house, Jerome went to his cousin's house and knocked on the door. But by the time someone made it to the door, Jerome was already leaving, so they didn't actually have an interaction with him. He must have peeled out of there because he crashed just about 800 feet away, going 90 miles an hour. Miraculously, there was a witness to the crash, the same sheriff's deputy who first discovered Jade's body. He saw Jerome zooming up the street near a curve and remembered thinking that the car was flying before it veered off the road and rolled over multiple times. Here's where it gets weird. When the car rolled over, 2 people were ejected from the car, Jerome and another man named Chris. The question on everyone's mind was, who the fuck is Chris? No one seemed to know who Chris was, adding to the mystery of the situation. It didn't appear that Jerome and Chris actually knew each other, Chris survived the crash somehow, though he didn't remember much about that night. According to Chris, he thinks he was walking along the road, and Jerome pulled over to give him a ride. To make matters even more confusing, there were some handwritten notes in the case files that referred to Peter and his uncle being at the crash scene. However, there was no context provided, and these weren't official reports. It's unclear if the police were just jotting down rumors that people were telling them later, or what the significance of these notes was. Jade and Jerome's family had a theory. They suspected that Peter was chasing Jerome or ran him off the road, mostly because there were rumors that Peter followed him after he left his uncle's house that night. However, this theory doesn't quite add up. If Peter was following Jerome, it's unclear what his motive would have been, especially considering that Jerome had stopped to pick up a stranger walking along the road and went to his cousin's house. It doesn't really sound like he was being chased, except for the dramatic speed at which he was driving, which could be attributed to his intoxicated state. The theory only makes sense if Peter didn't catch up to Jerome until after he left his cousin's house. But then, the question arises as to how Peter would have known that Jerome was going to his cousin's and not back to his mom's house. Additionally, the cop who witnessed the crash would have likely seen if someone was chasing Jerome. The reporter, Nina, went back to talk to the officer who witnessed the crash to gain a better understanding of the situation. Due to the layout of the road and the way it bends, the officer explained that you wouldn't necessarily see a second vehicle behind Jerome's if he was being chased. When Nina asked the officer if Peter was there or not, he said that he didn't remember if Peter and his uncle showed up at any point. To be fair, the officer didn't handle Jerome's case. He just witnessed it and called it in. A different police agency actually investigated the crash, and once they realized that Jerome was drinking and speeding, they likely didn't do a deep dive into what led up to it. Following the tragic events, Jerome's death was written off as a horrible accident, and the siblings were laid to rest side by side on Thursday, August 23rd. At this point, investigators still didn't know if Jade's death was a homicide, suicide, or something else. As the dust cleared from some of the more outlandish theories, they focused on a few people who always seemed to be somewhere in the mix, starting with Peter. Peter's aunt and uncle said that on the night of the shooting, they had some friends over to play poker. Peter was there at times, but it's unclear who had eyes on him and when, as people were coming and going the whole time. It wouldn't have been all that hard for Peter to slip out and go to the apartment since they lived down the street from each other. Interestingly, Peter's aunt and uncle told two completely different stories about that night. Peter's uncle implied that they were home all night, and even remembered hearing the initial dispatch on their police scanner when Jade's neighbor called 911. It seems like listening to the police scanner was something they always did. This raises the question of whether this could be how Peter knew about Jade. However, it's doubtful, because even then, detectives didn't know who Jade was for a while. So, even if someone wanted to say there had been a homicide, why would Peter know it was Jade in the apartment? It's possible that he knew, because he was known for looking around and knew the address, so he just heard something happen on the scanner and knew it had to be her. Peter's uncle offered an explanation for how they learned about Jade's death, which didn't involve the scanner. He told police that two different women who called his wife that night were the ones who initially told them that Jory killed Jade. However, this is where things differ, because his wife told detectives that after her husband lost at poker, they went for a drive from around 8 Kuau to 11:30 or 11:45 that night. She said that, yes, she did talk to two women on the phone, but they didn't say that Jory was the shooter. In fact, one of them told her it was Jory who got shot. While it's tempting to chalk all of this up to a bad game of telephone, it's hard to write off when there are completely different stories of where they were that night from the start. It's not just a matter of the poker game ending at a specific time, but they were all in the house. One person is saying they were driving around in a car, while the other is saying they were all sitting in the house playing cards, two very different starting points. As for Peter, he told investigators that he ran a couple of errands, but was there playing poker during the crucial window of 10:30 to 11 when Jade was shot. Peter said he knew everyone was pointing the finger at him, but he had no clue why, because he didn't even really know Jade. She was his best friend's sister, so he had seen her around, but he said they had never even had a conversation or anything. When asked about the gun, he said he didn't have any connection to it, but he wasn't surprised to learn that there was a gun in the apartment of Jory's brother, who, remember, was also Jana's boyfriend. Peter told them that the rumor about Jory being the killer came from one of the women who called that night, not him. The story gets even messier when detectives go to talk to those two callers, but don't get any clarity there either, just a couple more stories. The friend who called Jory that first night and told her that Peter was accusing her of murder gives a different account of that call. She confirms that Peter had contacted her and another friend and told them something happened to Jade, but she apparently doesn't say he mentioned Jory at all. It's unclear who is telling the truth. Maybe they're all telling their own versions of it, and no one is outright lying. But everyone's memories are muddy. It's not certain if detectives confirmed Peter's alibi, or how they would even do that since Jade's apartment is like a 2-minute jog from his uncle's house. Peter is hardly the only person under suspicion, though. There's also Jade's boyfriend, Nick. Detectives learned that they had been dating for about 5 months, and everyone knew they were having problems. He had brought a ton of drama into her life by cheating on her with her friend, and he admitted that they argued that night. Some wonder if he followed her back to her apartment, waited for Jory to leave, and then shot her. However, he tells police that he was with a big group of friends all night. He says that after Jade called him at around 10:06, they didn't speak again. A few hours later, people started calling him saying that Jade had either been shot or died by suicide. He says that at first, he didn't even believe it. But then her family started calling, and he says that the calls turned threatening. So, he went to the station himself before police could even go looking for him. With Nick, investigators are able to confirm his alibi with cell tower records and witnesses, but there's still a question of whether someone connected to him, maybe the girl he was cheating with, did something. Then there's Jory. Todd, the chief deputy major, told us that he remembers catching her in lies. For instance, when he first spoke with her by phone the night of the shooting, she apparently told him that she was a few towns away, but she was really right outside. Police consider her to be the last known person to see Jade alive, given that small window of time between when she says she left and when the gun was fired. While Todd doesn't seem to think that she pulled the trigger, he's wondering if maybe she was there when the trigger was pulled. The question remains about what time Jory picked up Jana from Walmart. We know that the shot was fired right before the neighbor called 911. We know that the neighbor called 911 at 10:54, and Jana was at Walmart waiting for Jory to pick her up. The Walmart is about a 13-minute drive from their apartment, so while it's tight, it should clear Jory of at least being there when the shot was fired. Investigators likely pulled the Walmart surveillance footage to verify her story, but it's unclear what exactly they found. Todd remains suspicious that Jory might have information she's not sharing, especially after police hear about a previous incident at the apartment. They find out that Jory recently had an argument with her cousin's boyfriend at the apartment, during which she pulled out the same gun used in Jade's shooting. Jory tells police that it happened after a fight between the cousin and the boyfriend got physical. The boyfriend wouldn't leave, so she got the gun out from the entertainment center, but then a couple of other guys took it from her. The fight stopped, and that was it. She got the gun back and put it back in the entertainment center. Detectives also learned that there are conflicting accounts about Jory and Jade's relationship. Some people, including a couple of Jade's close friends, say that they didn't really like each other. However, Jory and Jana insist that this is not true. Jory said that she and Jade were like sisters, and Jana says they never even argued. Jana does think that Jade might have been a little jealous of their friendship and didn't like when Jana let Jory use the car. However, All of this sounds more like typical roommate or sibling arguing, not a recipe for murder. Jana's opinion is that the suspicion that fell on Jory after Jade's death impacted people's memories of how they really were, like the opposite of rose-colored glasses. When police give a round of polygraphs to Jory, Jana, Nick, and Peter, Jory is the only one who doesn't pass. Her results for one of the questions, whether she was withholding information about Jade's death, are inconclusive. However, this might not be a huge deal for a couple of reasons. 1, because polygraphs in general are not always reliable. And 2, we know that at the time she's taking this polygraph, she had been lying about how the gun ended up in the apartment to cover for her brother. Speaking of Jory's brother, who we'll call Isaac, police are keeping an eye on him too. He's not really a person of interest per se because he was in jail, but investigators wonder if maybe his lifestyle led to this. Isaac was selling drugs at times from Jana's apartment, so maybe he screwed someone over and they wanted to send a message, so they killed Jade. To be sure, detectives interview Isaac in jail, but he refuses to even admit that the gun is his and doesn't say that anyone is out to get him or anything like that. The question arises as to why Isaac's enemies would go after Jade. It's possible that they were hoping to get his sister or his girlfriend, which could play into the wrong place, wrong time scenario. If someone saw Jory leaving and didn't know it was Jory, they might have targeted Jade. However, there's an issue with the idea of someone trying to send Isaac a message. If that was the case, they did a poor job relaying it, because no one knows what the message is, if this is a message at all. There are so many theories going around that even the sheriff's office is divided, according to Todd. But to Jade's mom, Mary, it seems like investigators are convinced that Jade took her own life based on the impression she's getting. She remembers them questioning her about Jade's moods, which she told them were almost always happy. Jade had just started her senior year of high school, had tons of friends, a big loving family, and was looking forward to going off to college soon on a volleyball scholarship. However, a couple of people that detectives speak with remember times when Jade was depressed. For instance, the father of a friend tells them that Jade once said something like, "Maybe the world would be better off without me," and we know she was definitely upset about the trouble with her boyfriend. Depression can be incredibly nuanced, and being a teenager is hard. Even the hosts of the podcast recall having dramatic thoughts as teenagers, like wondering if they should even be here, without actually contemplating doing anything. They reminisce about one of their journals from that time, which had wildly varying entries from one page to the next, expressing love for life, and then wishing for death with no context. It's important to reiterate that for Jade, most everyone says that she was a cheerful, happy person. By mid-September, Todd firmly believes Jade was murdered. Todd told the podcast hosts that about half the department, along with the medical examiner, agrees with him that Jade was murdered. Over the next few months, as police get lab test results back, they confirm that the gun at the scene was used in the shooting and that it can actually be fired without a clip. The magazine chamber lock is also found to be defective, with the clip falling partially out of the gun while they were testing it. The only DNA found on the gun is Jade's blood, and there are no usable prints, not even a fingertip on the trigger. However, Todd thinks that the absence of evidence can be evidence too, and he believes that the gun was wiped clean. He figures that if Jade was gripping the clip tight enough for it to stay in her hand after she fell, there should be something left behind, like oil or skin. Meanwhile, gunshot residue test kits submitted for Jade and Nick come back positive, suggesting that they might have fired a gun, touched something related to a fired gun, or had their right hands close to a fired gun in recent times. It's worth mentioning that Jade was right-handed. Nick tells police that he hasn't fired a gun in years, but it's important to note that GSR testing is pretty unreliable, similar to polygraphs. Investigators don't really dwell on the results, and they knew that Nick was working on a car earlier that day, which can give false positives. It's unclear if they tested everyone else and if their results were negative, as many reports are missing. As the new year rolls around, authorities are no closer to making any official determination about what happened in that apartment. Finally, the coroner decides to do something unusual for Saline County. He holds an inquest. This is basically a court hearing, where a jury hears about the case from investigators and witnesses, and then issues a verdict on the manner of death. On Thursday, January 31st, 2008, the coroner tells the jury that Jade's case has been among the most difficult he has ever worked on. There's been a ton of hearsay, but no concrete evidence to back anything up. Police have chased a lot of plausible theories, but there was always something that didn't fit with each one. The jury hears testimony about the case, the lab results, and the polygraphs. The medical examiner testifies that usually, cases become understandable or clear with time. But in the months since Jade died, he still cannot make sense of the situation. The crime scene investigator tells the jury that the positioning of Jade's body just doesn't seem right to him. Even Todd testifies that all things considered, he thinks there is more pointing to homicide than suicide or accident. At the end of the inquest hearing, the jury rules that Jade's death was a homicide. Watching from the gallery, Mary bursts into tears, as she has been waiting for this validation ever since she saw the suspicious-looking blood on her daughter's face. She tells reporter John D. Holman of the Southern Illinoisan that she is convinced her daughter's death is connected to her son Jerome's, and to her, this might be the start of finding out what happened to them both, or at least getting justice for Jade. However, after the inquest, nothing really significant happens for months until September 2008, when a new lead shakes things up. Investigators get a tip that Jana's boyfriend and Jory's brother, Isaac, who is in prison, might have information about Jade's death after all, and he's willing to give it in exchange for a reduced sentence. When investigators meet with Isaac in prison, he tells them that before he went to jail in the spring of 2007, he and a friend met up with 3 men from Kentucky who had come into town to buy drugs from him. The men started acting sketchy, as if they were going to rob him, so Isaac zapped one of them with a stun gun, took their money, between $10,000 and $20,000, and fled. Isaac says that he heard the men were threatening to kill him and driving around looking for him. He even claims that one of the men had been to Jana's apartment before the robbery and was pretty sure that the guy knew where the gun was in the house, although Isaac still maintains that the gun wasn't his. There are some issues with this story, such as how a random guy would know that the gun was in the entertainment center, and the fact that there was no disarray or forced entry at the crime scene. Both the front and side doors of the small duplex apartment were unlocked when the police arrived and saw Jade through the window. However, investigators still feel it's worth getting the information and checking these guys out. The problem is that Isaac doesn't know the men's names, although he is able to describe them and their cars. When investigators contact Kentucky law enforcement, they seem to know exactly who they're talking about. A detective there tells them that 2 of the men, who are brothers, have family living just outside of town, and the third guy has a past conviction for attempted murder. Even the cars match the descriptions of suspicious ones spotted near the apartment that night. The Kentucky lead doesn't really come to a conclusion or provide a clear story or explanation for Jade's case, proving to be another brick wall. Mary believes that Isaac was just looking to cut a deal and that the lead isn't even true. For whatever reason, perhaps due to the issues mentioned earlier, the lead seems to fizzle out, with no further reports on it. The next significant development doesn't occur until March 2010, when Todd asks a former FBI agent who runs a forensic consulting firm to evaluate Jade's case based on the crime scene. In May, the consultant issues his report, stating that in his opinion, Jade took her own life. He believes that Jade held the gun with her right hand, her dominant hand, supported by her left, which, along with the defective magazine lock, could explain why the clip was found in that hand. In crime scene photos, blood drops on Jade's inner left arm suggest it was bent, while a blood drop on the inner arc of her sock indicates to the consultant that she was sitting cross-legged on the floor. This positioning, might also account for the trajectory of the bullet and the cast-off blood spatter on the coffee table and wall. The consultant takes all of this information, combined with the positive gunshot residue test, and concludes that it all adds up to suicide. However, the report fails to address the blood flow on Jade's face, which is clearly visible in the photos. If Jade was sitting upright when she started bleeding, it could potentially explain why the blood dripped on her nose and mouth. The blood pattern is described as running across her right cheekbone to her upper lip, where it splits into two lines. One line goes over her upper lip and stops abruptly in a small round spot on the left side of her upper lip, while the other line goes around the bottom of her nose, curves around to the left side of her nose, and also stops in a small round dot. The hosts of the podcast theorize about how the blood could have dripped down Jade's face if she was sitting upright and her head fell forward before ultimately falling back. They suggest that the droplets might have gone straight down initially, but when she fell back, the remaining droplets could have dripped back down her face a little. However, they acknowledge that they would expect to see more paths and that the amount of time she would have been upright for this to occur seems very short, likely less than half a second. The hosts conclude that they need an expert to weigh in on this matter, as they are only making educated guesses and don't want to engage in the equivalent of improper jury experiments. The hosts continue to discuss the potential scenarios that could explain the blood pattern on Jade's face. They note that if Jade was sitting cross-legged, she would have had pretty good balance, so perhaps her head fell before she fell to one side. However, they struggle to understand how she would have ended up in the sprawled-out starfish position with her arms and legs spread out if that were the case. Additionally, none of these scenarios explain the blood pool that is located away from her head. It's important to keep in mind that the consultant's evaluation is based solely on the physical evidence collected at the scene that night and does not take into account witness statements or the coroner's inquest transcript. Furthermore, the consultant is not an expert in blood stain pattern analysis. He suggests that the sheriff's office contact 2 independent consultants he knows of for a second opinion. But according to Todd, this doesn't happen because the sheriff's office didn't want to spend the money. Todd still believes that Jade's death was a homicide, but his opinion may not matter because in July of that year, he gets arrested. Todd, the deputy chief major, is arrested after being charged with sexual assault and official misconduct involving a 16 or 17-year-old intern at the sheriff's office. He later faces more charges involving the same victim. In September 2011, at the age of 44, he pleads guilty to 1 count of aggravated criminal sexual abuse. In exchange, the state drops nearly 20 other charges, which by then also include theft of governmental property for allegedly billing the sheriff's office for services related to his private business. According to Scott Fitzgerald's reporting for the Southern Illinoisan, Todd receives a 3-year prison sentence, followed by 2 years of parole, and he has to register as a sex offender for life. While Todd's crimes and later conviction bring his credibility into question and raise the possibility that he continues to disagree with his former institution about the case simply because he has an axe to grind, he is not the only one who thought that Jade was murdered. The hosts want to keep the focus on Jade, and the reason they bring up Todd's situation is because his crimes and conviction had a devastating impact on her investigation, which essentially comes to a halt. The consultant's report is the last thing in the case file, and the media seems to forget about Jade's case as well. There wasn't a single news article about Jade from 2011 onward, at least until last year, when her family held a peaceful protest, hoping to reignite efforts to investigate her death. The current situation revolves around the investigation of Jade's death, which involved a gunshot wound. The top law enforcement officials, including Sheriff Whipper Johnson, personally believe that Jade's wound was self-inflicted. However, they claim that their personal opinions do not affect the official investigation, because a coroner's jury ruled the death a homicide. The sheriff stated that jurors at an inquest only hear one side of the story, suggesting that the jury's decision could have been influenced to reach a particular ruling. Despite their personal beliefs, the officials assert that they want to solve the case and are capable of conducting an unbiased investigation. However, they claim they currently have no leads to pursue. The narrator expresses skepticism about the lack of progress, noting that the officials admitted to Nina, presumably an investigator or journalist, that they know very little about the case after all these years. Shockingly, the sheriff himself admitted to not having read any of the case files. This raises questions about how they can be certain there are no leads to follow. It's pointed out that Nina has examined files that the sheriff has not, yet he remains confident that Jade died by suicide. When questioned about the basis of his opinion, the sheriff revealed that it stems from a conversation he had years ago with a now retired state police investigator who believed it was suicide. Further investigation revealed that this state investigator, on whose opinion the sheriff heavily relies, was only at the crime scene for about 90 minutes and barely worked on the case. This casts doubt on the depth of knowledge this investigator had about the case details. Adding to the complexity, Todd, whose credibility is somewhat questionable due to personal issues, claimed that the same state investigator actually believed it was a homicide and that the scene was staged. Attempts to contact this retired investigator for clarification have so far been unsuccessful. The narrator expresses doubt about the officials' claim that their personal opinions won't affect the case, arguing that if they personally believe it was suicide, they're unlikely to prioritize the investigation. However, it's noted that when a family member provided a lead this past summer, the officials did follow up on it. Additionally, at the urging of the narrators or investigators, they contacted a blood spatter expert. This expert declined to take on new cases, but recommended they consult another crime scene expert. As of the last update, it was unclear whether this recommendation had been acted upon, with officials stating they would look into it. The narrative continues with a discussion about potential leads in Jade's case that haven't been fully explored. The narrator suggests that if the authorities are serious about finding new information, they should formally interview Jerome's fiancé. Jerome is identified as Jana and Jade's brother. The narrator then introduces a significant revelation from Jerome's fiancé, describing it as a bombshell. This information contradicts earlier statements made by Peter to detectives. Previously, Peter had claimed that he only knew of Jade through his connection to Jerome, and that they had never spoken or had any relationship. However, Jerome's fiancé reveals that not only did Peter and Jade know each other, but they were also romantically involved. She describes their relationship as brief and informal, using the term talking to characterize it. This involvement reportedly occurred just a few months before Jade's death. The narrator speculates that this relationship might have overlapped with Peter and Jory's relationship. Interestingly, Jade was apparently more concerned about Jerome finding out about her involvement with Peter than she was about Jory's reaction. Jade had confided in Jerome's fiancé, expressing worry that her brother would disapprove due to his friendship with Peter and Peter's older age and questionable reputation. Jerome's fiancé mentions that this was the only time Jade ever mentioned Peter to her. She believes they might have hung out once, but isn't certain. She also thinks that Jade's romantic interest shifted back to Nick shortly after her brief involvement with Peter. The narrator notes that this information was not widely known. Neither Jana, Jory, nor Mary were aware of it. The only people who knew were Jerome's fiancé and one other close friend. Importantly, this relationship is not mentioned in any police reports. The narrator then speculates whether Jory might have known about this relationship, suggesting it could provide a motive similar to that of Nick and the other friend. However, Nina, who conducted interviews, believes that Jory was genuinely unaware of any relationship between Jade and Peter. The story concludes by emphasizing how well kept this secret was in a town where everyone knows everyone's business. Nina reportedly played audio from her interviews where people learn about this relationship, and their reaction is described as a collective gasp, indicating genuine surprise at this revelation. The narrative continues with a clarification about how the information regarding Jade and Peter's relationship was revealed. It was Jerome's fiancée who disclosed this information, causing surprise among those present. The narrator emphasizes that this revelation was unexpected, with everyone reacting with shock. The story then shifts to concerns about the completeness of the case records. The sheriff's office claims to have provided all available information, but the narrator suspects that some records are missing. This suspicion arises from hearing about significant details that cannot be verified due to lack of documentation. One major discrepancy involves reports of a footprint on Jade's front door. Mary and Jerome's fiancé recall seeing such a print, suggesting someone tried to kick in the door. However, Todd denies the existence of this footprint, and there's no mention or photographic evidence of it in the case files. The narrator notes that the available crime scene photographs are black and white photocopies without close-ups of the door, making independent verification impossible. Todd provides additional information about a bloody fingerprint on the outside of the front door, which he claims crime scene investigators forgot to document. However, the deputy who was first on the scene, now a major, doesn't recall seeing this. Another unverified detail from Todd is that the medical examiner found an impression of Jade's ear in the pool of blood by her head, indicating she was on her side at some point. Again, there's no official documentation of this observation. The lack of consistent and complete information has led to tension in the community. Despite no official suspect being named, many locals have formed their own conclusions. Jory, who has been the subject of rumors, maintains her innocence and believes Peter killed Jade, possibly intending to target Jory instead. Jade's family and other friends also suspect Peter, with various theories about motive and potential accomplices. Todd is undecided, considering both Peter and individuals connected to Isaac's drug activities as possible perpetrators. Peter declined to be interviewed, only stating that he had nothing to do with Jade's death. The narrative notes that Peter has faced legal troubles since, including protection orders filed by multiple women and an unrelated murder charge that was plea bargained down to obstruction. The story concludes with Sheriff Johnson stating his office's willingness to request assistance from other agencies, although he's skeptical about receiving help. The narrator expresses hope that such assistance will be sought, believing it's what the case needs to progress. The narrative continues with the suggestion that turning over the case completely to another agency, if possible, would be a significant step in the right direction. The narrator emphasizes that what this case needs most is a fresh perspective from neutral investigators who are willing to thoroughly examine the evidence and try their best to resolve the case once and for all. The narrator stresses that Jade deserves this level of dedication to her case, as do her family members. Additionally, those who have fallen under suspicion and the entire community would benefit from a comprehensive and impartial investigation. The story then shifts to providing information on how listeners or interested parties can help advance Jade's case. Two options are presented. 1. Following the recommendation of a civil rights attorney, people are encouraged to write directly to the Illinois Attorney General's office, requesting their involvement in the case. This approach suggests that public pressure and formal requests to higher authorities might prompt a re-examination or takeover of the investigation by state-level officials. The implication is that the Attorney General's office may have resources and a level of independence that could benefit the case. The narrative ends here, implying that there may have been a second option mentioned, but it was not included in the provided text. The overall tone of the conclusion emphasizes the importance of continued efforts to seek justice for Jade and closure for all those affected by her death.